You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
I want to introduce a tradition here for this podcast and all future podcasts, wherein I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Knowing the stories of the Aboriginal people will always be written in this landscape. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. So I firstly need to apologise. I've missed one podcast, mainly because I've been struggling with sinusitis and a respiratory infection, and then to boot was tested positive with COVID. Now, one of the things people often ask me at the moment is, so how sick were you with COVID? And I honestly can't answer that because if I did have any symptoms from COVID, it was completely intermingled with my respiratory infection, for which I'm being treated with antibiotics. So bear with me, because as you can hear, occasionally my voice goes slightly haywire. Okay, so let me pick up. To date, we've been spending a bit of time, talking about the issue about wellness. Okay, and so, we've spoken about emotional wellness. In today's podcast, I'm going to talk about mental wellness, and specifically what I want to talk about is wellness from the process of thinking. How do I think about things, and how does that influence my resilience? Okay, so I really want to define that very, very clearly, because one of the issues that's often gets confused in sort of day-to-day language is the issue between what's feelings and what's thoughts. I often get, especially men, when I ask them about, what are you feeling? And they give me a string of thoughts about what they think. Work's really, really tough, or the kids are being difficult. That's an expression of what you're thinking, your internal dialogue. Whereas what I'm really asking is, how do you feel? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling upset? Are you feeling angry, frustrated? What is the feeling? And a good way to get in touch with that is actually to look into what my senses are telling me. Now, does that delegitimize the issue about my thoughts? Absolutely not. Hamlet in Shakespeare, and I've spoken about this before in podcasts, makes the observation of things are neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Now, I've often talked about a little bit of a caveat on that, but let's take that for absolutely what it is. That is, the way that I think shapes my emotional reaction. Okay, so I'll get into that a little bit further a little later on. So when we talk about mental wellness, what are we actually referring to? Well, firstly, mental wellness is much, much more than simply the absence of mental illness. And let me define mental illness. In my book, mental illness comes down to bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. All the other diagnosable conditions that we talk about in psychology and psychiatry, in my book, are either states of psychological distress, disturbance, or disorders. So that's a really important distinction. And in fact, there are certain psychologists like Dr. Robert Spillane who will argue that there is in fact no such thing as a mental illness, right? So one could argue that, for example, schizophrenia or bipolar 1 is in fact a neurological disorder of some kind, and we've yet have to get to terms with exactly what that is, neurologically speaking. Where is all of that located? Okay, next, mental wellness is fundamentally going from surviving to thriving. In other words, it's not just me getting by, but it's actually me flourishing as a human being in the context of my life, my environment. And that is very, very, very important. That distinction, especially in today's society, is critical, right? Because part of thriving is actually also to be flexible and to be resilient. Okay, when I'm surviving, I'm hugely reactive, very, very dependent on my environment to sort of try and prop me up. Whereas when I'm thriving, a lot of that comes from my inner resources, my relationship with myself, and also the context in which I relate to my feelings. Because it's one of the things that happens is that when I feel something, I usually have some sort of evaluation about what it is that I'm feeling. So if I'm feeling angry and I have a taboo about being angry, part of my reaction is going to be, I shouldn't feel angry. Okay. Mental wellness needs to be aligned to body and values, attitudes, beliefs, morality, ethics, the whole kit. Okay, so it really, really is important to begin to see this as a whole. Okay, so simply having cognitions, whether they're positive or negative, doesn't necessarily bring about my capacity to thrive. So let me pick up with the whole issue of mental as a cognition or a set of cognitions and how I define those. Now, when I try to explain this to my clients, I usually talk about the importance of being logical, rational, and objective. So when we talk about objective thinking, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about being flexible and open, as well as all the other principles that require freedom from ways of thinking that are narrow-minded, sectarian, bigoted, and fanatical. And that we, rely on uncritical acceptance of dogmatic beliefs or magical explanations for the world and what happens in it. In other words, I refer to that stuff as stinking thinking, right? So the whole thing about objectivity is based in that area of flexibility and openness. Let me check out what it is that I'm thinking, especially when it comes to some of the things that we're exposed to at the moment, either politically or religiously or, other forms of ideology. So objective thinking fundamentally is scientific in nature, and it has 4 aspects to it. Firstly, it's empirical. And secondly, it's logical. Thirdly, it's pragmatic. And in the fourth instance, it's flexible. So what do I mean by empirical? Okay? Fundamentally, objective thinking is based on conclusions that validly follow from the evidence. It is possible, as the example below demonstrates, to have the right evidence, but to draw the wrong conclusion. So, for example, in this illustrates it, I think, quite well. I do a lot of stuff with, in business. So my supervisors criticised me. First thought. Second thought, I don't like being criticised. Person then draws the conclusion that I can't stand this. I shouldn't be criticised. And it shows that my supervisor is a rotten human being. Now, even the two pieces of evidence are correct, the conclusion is false. It doesn't logically follow that because I've been criticised and I don't like it, both of which are true, that my supervisor's rotten. Right? The other thing that follows on is that I can't stand being criticised and it shouldn't happen to me. These are beliefs. They're not truths, okay? And let me not stray too far into that topic that truth is relative, it's how you look at it and everyone has a truth. No, there is truth and then there is falsehood. Very simple. I'm not into, that sort of relativism. So, in a lot of instances, when we're emotionally upset, we make these errors of thinking. So, I can give you a string of beliefs, irrational beliefs that we have, often, that we hold very dearly onto it. So, in this one, it was that, I can't stand any form of discomfort. I should always be praised. Now, I know I'm making this into sort of very absolute statements, but that's essentially a good way of getting at the whole idea that I need to challenge my thinking. I need to challenge my beliefs. If they're not objective and based on evidence, I've got a problem. One of the core irrational beliefs a lot of people carry inside and often act accordingly is that somehow they're not good enough. And when you challenge them, when I say to the person, well, how is it that you're not good enough? They'll cherry pick certain examples that they'll deliver to me as fact, okay? So, I failed my HSC. Well, that's actually not evidence that you're not good enough. It just simply either reflects that you were having a bad time studying, you didn't study at all, you went blank in the exam because you were anxious, or you just did the wrong exam. So there's many, many different ways of looking at this. Okay, so let's talk about objective thinking being pragmatic. What do I mean by that? So science fundamentally evaluates an idea not just on its evidence or logical validity, but also on its usefulness to human beings. In other words, we need to be concerned with the effects, both short and long term, of what I believe. So questions that I might want to ask in that is, what effect does believing this have on how I feel and behave? Does this belief help or hinder me in achieving my goals? So let me take the first question, which I think is really, really important. If I believe in life, right, then does holding a belief that infringes upon someone else's life who holds a different belief, and I try to reinforce that by dominating that person, by controlling that person, is that sound? And the answer is that no, for a start it's unethical and it's immoral. I'm making moral judgments about somebody else and trying to enforce that they behave according to my beliefs. Now, does it help me to achieve my goals? Probably not. Maybe in the short term, but ultimately, the chances are that I'm probably going to have a pretty hard time of it. Although right now in the world, it seems to be that those sorts of attitudes have some foothold, right? So I bring this back to the thing is that mental wellness isn't just about my beliefs, my attitudes, my values, but the alignment of those attitudes into an ethical, moral framework. Right? So if I judge someone for doing something that I have done myself but don't admit to, then I'm being simply a hypocrite. Now, unless I'm a psychopath or a sociopath, I'm not going to feel too badly about that. But most people get conflicted about this, so it generates anxiety. It generates a poor disposition in myself. All right, next point. Objective thinking is open-minded and flexible. So nothing is seen as absolute or the last word. I mean, ultimately in science, it's not just the results that we're looking for, but it's actually looking for better questions. Beliefs are seen as theories that are subject to change as new evidence comes along and existing ideas are proven false, right? So objectivity encourages us to continually search for explanations that are more accurate and useful than the ones we have now. So, here's the thing. Why is objective thinking so important in managing stress? Well, because it increases our tolerance for frustration and discomfort. And it also means that I'm going to be less judgmental about myself when I make mistakes. So I'm not overgeneralizing. I'm not drawing, absolutistic conclusions about myself when they're not demonstrably true. So unscientific thinking in of itself can create significant distress. And this can happen when you view criticism as unbearable, when you demand that you have to be successful, or that you rate yourself as a total person rather than simply according to your behaviours. The other big issue is that often people believe that we're controlled by outside forces, fate, luck, karma, and all those things can actually lead to strong feelings of anxiety, powerlessness, helplessness, hopelessness, and more importantly, lead us to take a passive approach to life and its problems. And so we need to really challenge it. So how can I develop objective thinking? How can I challenge the erroneous or irrational beliefs that I might be holding? So one way of doing it is using a rational self-analysis to challenge my thinking. Okay, really sit down, ask yourself, where's the evidence for what I think? How does it affect me? Is it getting me closer to my goals? Is it useful? Is it making me a good companion in life to somebody else? So another way of checking in is, am I examining my magical thinking? So for example, in OCD, that's a common issue. So I'll get triggered, and then I'm going to go and wash my hands, and I have to wash my hands 4 times on the left, 4 times on the right, and then do another 5 times in the middle. And if I don't do that exact sequence, something bad is going to happen to me or somebody else. That isn't true. There is no relationship between you washing your hands and something bad happening to yourself or somebody else that you care for. What it will do is it will increase your anxiety, and therefore you're more than likely going to do more hand washing. Make sense? The less you wash your hands in that circumstance, the less ritualistic and magically engaged you are with what you're doing, the more likely it is that your anxiety is going to diminish over time, because ultimately there is no evidence that something horrible is going to happen to you if you don't wash your hands 4 times on the left, 4 times on the right, 5 times in the middle, and then you dry your hands. There's nothing that's going to come together that ostensibly can be proven to connect those events. The other thing too, and I think this is really important, let me encourage you to read up on rational thinking, not positive thinking. There is an element where positive thinking is useful, but it needs to come under the umbrella of rational thinking. Some positive thinking is in fact irrational. And so other factors involved here are developing other principles and beliefs that will, consolidate your objective ways of thinking. So, for example, emotional responsibility, taking ownership for your behaviour, taking ownership for being self-directed, And finally, we come back to that thing about being flexible. Unfortunately, when we're in a state of distress or we're experiencing a psychological disorder, we become more rigid. And the more rigid we become, the more stressed we become, the more irrationally we are going to react to things, and therefore we're going to feel greater degrees of distress. All right, everybody. At this point, I could go on with this for quite a while. I hope I've given you some of the core principles in the whole idea of objective thinking and mental wellness. Go out there, apply it. You know, one of the things that I encourage people to do a lot is read Zen, read Stoicism, read some of the philosophers. Get, your thinking to be critical about the stuff that you read and see how it fits. Now, the chances are in Zen and Stoicism, you're going to find some kernels of real truth. There are some philosophies that are possibly as irrational as some of my own ideas about, being irrational. Play around with it. If you put this into practice, I can guarantee you're going to change, and you're going to change for the better in the right direction. So the next time you're having an argument and your partner says to you, you made me feel X, Y, Z, in your head you can go, well, actually I'm not responsible entirely on how she feels, but rather respond outwardly in going, well, tell me a little bit more about how that happened. What is it that I did that I need to take ownership for here? But ultimately, how she feels comes through the lens of her values, attitudes, beliefs, and will be determined by how rational or not rational she is in that moment. But remember, it's never a good idea just to throw at your partner that she's being irrational. That goes down as well as telling her what to feel. And on that note, this is me signing off for this week. Until next time, inspire change in yourself and others. It'll make your life significantly better.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.